So, the newest Intervallo released in Limbus company, at least as of the posting of this video, and oh my god, I love it a lot, and so I'm gonna yap about it because I can. Yippee! I've never done this style of video before, so bear with the scuff. Now, if you somehow click this video without knowing what Limbus company even is, then allow me to do my usual shill. Limbus Company is a free-to-play gacha game that you can play on Steam or mobile. It is a turn-based RPG with a really rich, deep world building with a colorful cast of multifaceted characters and a dark fiction dystopian plot. Go play it, it's free, and the gacha is not predatory compared to other gachas I've played. Hoyovers. Anyway, this video will have spoilers for the LCB regular checkup Intervallo, obviously. So first off, the story starts off with the typical trope of we're in the middle of action, how did we get here? Which today I learned is called in media res. But the most fun part with this trope usage is that right off the bat, Otis makes fun of how the auto win rate system currently works. She says, what's the point of everyone rushing at the same enemy that's already staggered or nearly dead? Which is something that I'm pretty sure most of us who regularly press the auto win rate button during our regular daily and weekly grinds are all too familiar with. It is a nice little acknowledgement of their gameplay quirks from the writer themselves, and I appreciate that they're willing to poke fun at their own flaws, essentially canonizing it. Part of the fun with the Intervallos in general, for me anyway, is seeing the sinners bantering with one another and shedding more light on their personalities and quirks, bit by bit. Also, just in general, I love the dynamics between the sinners. For instance, during the flashback about how we even got to the LCE research lab in the first place, we got comments from the sinners about how they're feeling more stiff these days, and then Hong Lu just casually calls Don Quixote old, essentially. The reaction from the other sinners is complete awkwardness, and I love it. Also, rip Don, my beloved. Anyway, the bantering between Heathcliff and Ishmael continues, to which I adore, because Ishmael really doesn't hold back on the punches, especially towards Heath, and I love her so much. Also, I might have a Heath male bias, I'm so sorry. It is also here that we learn regular checkups can mean a variety of things within Project Moon's world, such as a complete bloodbath to see who is the most fit of them all, as Ishmael had to deal with, to just a regular fitness check that Sinclair went through at school, or even spraying someone with a spray to detect lice like Heathcliff. During this segment, we also learn that W Corp is declining due to events that happened in Library of Runa and recently within Limbus Company, mostly dealing with missing passengers and the subsequent loss of trust in W Corp as a result of that. So therefore, a new company is aspiring to take over W Corp's position, which may potentially allude to the great disaster that'll be happening soon, as teased in their trailer. Or mayhaps not. Only time will tell for that one. Some other bits that I appreciated in this Intervallo was that the EX clear conditions for some of these stages were not the usual clear within X turns or a simple clear stage. They actually took the time to make some of these unique to each scenario being played out within the story. Combine it with the fact that you are limited to what sinners you can bring to each section, it makes people have to think a little bit about how they would clear these. I genuinely appreciate moments like this. After all, by the time you get to this Intervallo, you should theoretically have an ID battle ready for each sinner to use, unless you're like really new and super binged up to this point. Anyway, during this segment, we also got a bit more details into each Pekatula and why they look the way they do in relation to the sin they represent. We also got to see the new Stage 3 forms of the Gloom and Sloth Pekatula, and by golly, the Gloom one is so pretty and gives me the impression of it having like a veil behind its head. I dare say it almost looks angelic to me, even if it's supposedly like a weird evolved water bug thing. Fighting it is kind of a pain though, cause boy does it make your sinners depressed. It's doing its job properly, I suppose. For the sloth dude, look at that! It's like a little mountain! I think it's a neat design, but man, doing the EX clear condition on this one felt a bit rough for me personally. It was the only one I couldn't first try EX clear and required me to look at sin resistances to get that one done more efficiently. Overall though, this section of the Intervallo was enjoyable from a fighting and team planning perspective, as well as insightful story-wise to learn more about each sin. Thank God Lust got clarified to not just be about the carnal interpretation that so many people seem to default to. Like, come on y'all, we all know Project Moon isn't thinking in traditional Gooner style. They got a much more refined taste for things. Anyway, we also get solid confirmation that all the sinners have been brought down their average strength to that of the weakest sinner, which at the time when they signed onto the contract with Dante just happened to be Sinclair, all thanks to the effects of the Golden Bow, whose power is connection. Of course, this doesn't remove everyone's idiosyncrasies, as Faust calls it, which leads me to my next bit. Don Quixote, or rather, Sancho, my wife and my beloved. No, seriously, in case you didn't know, I literally own a 6-foot giant cardboard cutout of Sancho, and there has not been a single day where I haven't thought about her since the final part of her canto. That's literally over 3 going on 4 months of hyperfixation and mental illness. And dear God, just listen to these ungodly noises when I came to the realization that 1, you're gonna fight a singular enemy, 2, the title of the segment is The Price of Curiosity, and 3, you can't select Don Quixote as a sinner. I'm being for real, just listen. I'm inconsolable at this moment. Anyway, I greatly enjoy this particular section of the Intervallo for a variety of reasons. Yes, I know, seeing my vampire wife once more so soon after her canto is 100% a bias that I'm obsessed with. But beyond that, it has aspects that I think is objectively good narrative and lore-wise. For instance, we find out that Don Quixote, despite being centuries old and regaining her memories of her time as serious Sancho, can still be surprisingly petty and immature at times. Hohenheim and his team are not at all subtle about their taunting either, essentially calling Don Quixote a coward and basically like a chicken, like walk walk whoop, which is a humorous for this lead up. It all seems lighthearted, and given that we've seen Sancho in Canto 7 and how relatively sane she was after she took off her shoes, we reasonably expect her to seem this way if she takes off her shoes now post the fall of La Mancha Land. Don Quixote herself too must believe so. Yet this humorous, curious little experiment of everyone's is dashed just as quick as we find out that no. Taking off Rocinante causes a strange phenomenon where her blood fiend blood remembers that of those that passed from her lineage, their thirst and pleas, going so far as to thrust her into the position of her father as the surviving eldest Manchegan blood fiend, with the fallen kindreds calling her mother and begging for human blood. This is something no one could anticipate within the story, and for us as the player, I actually appreciate this. Again, because we get to see Sancho once more, and oh my god, do I love her messy short hair, and I really wish she got to keep this messy look for her as Don Quixote, but alas. But also because inevitably someone would ask, oh hey, we have a second kindred on our team, can't we just have Dawn take off Rocinante and have her deal with it and then slip her shoes back on? This is essentially Project Moon's way to tell us, yeah, that won't work out because now there's severe consequences if she takes off Rocinante. You can't just abuse her being a second kindred to try steamroll your way through stuff like a Deus Ex Machina. This is essentially them hard capping us at keeping us where we're at, which is Don Quixote must be Don Quixote because she's otherwise too unstable as Sancho at the moment because of the overwhelming thirst from, well, being super starved herself and now having the starvations of her dead family members heaped on top of her. Anyway, seeing Sancho angry and feral makes me so happy, and I'm trying really hard not to think about all the comparisons to that one gif from the Blue Lock anime with the dude sticking out his tongue. But yeah, I love getting my ass handed to me by Sancho once more, but this time it's easier since Virgilius comes to help us out and he immediately brings out his ego and kicks her with 3 rings of light just to suppress her. And that's while she's starved of blood and therefore at her weakest. Damn. I kind of fear, and also heavily anticipate and salivate at, seeing Sancho when she's well fed, someday in the future. Anyway, continuing on, we finally get Rocinante back on her feet, and she is back to normal. Hohenheim immediately tells Don Quixote she'll be getting regular shipments of artificial blood to help curb her hunger and give us a bit more insight into how blood is a bit more complicated thing for blood fiends, being capable of holding abstract values within the bloodline such as their unquenchable thirst. He also notes that she has people who will literally throw their lives to try suppress her, so therefore she won't need control from other departments. Shortly after, she seems downcast, saying that she shall never remove her shoes again. But Heathcliff says an uplifting phrase that no, she should persevere to one day be able to take off her shoes and be herself, essentially. It's cute. I love Heath and Dawn's moments. It's oddly wholesome between the two. Before we move on for real from Don Quixote's bit of this script, I just have to say that I find it interesting how nervous Faust is when Don Quixote brings up anything about P Corp in this one section, and then when Don asks Dante if they are concealing anything. Now, I already suspect something messed up is going to happen whenever we revisit Dawn's arc in Purgatorio or later because P Corp has her dad's corpse to study, but goodness, that's so far from now, one can only imagine what horrors will await us then. Now, on to my last and final section. It is dedicated to my most favorite character from this Intervallo, Hohenheim. Hohenheim is interesting because he's a character that gets introduced only in this Intervallo, and he appears, for every bit of the word, to be an egomaniac and a bit of a hard-ass. He is the chief researcher of Limbus company, if only because Faust and Yi Sang are not allowed to be so given their status as sinners. That being said, he does and says things that are intriguing and insightful. For all of Hohenheim's self-praise and taking ownership over achievements done by his group, he actually is genuinely intelligent and not just spewing hot air. He does seem to give an air of authority in his expertise, which in this case is being a researcher doing, well, researcher things, including essentially experiments to test various variables. I like it. But the intriguing thing is when he announces he needs an assistant. Some of the sinners spoke up asking to not get picked, and others felt obligated to try sell themselves a little bit, only for Hohenheim to eventually choose the least likely candidate that most people would have in mind for a smart dude's research assistant, Heathcliff. He explains it as citing that many great discoveries were made from a potent mix of spontaneity and intuition, preferring Heathcliff's aggressive and passionate approach. Heathcliff seems to take this role surprisingly well, with a bit of docilness, which is entertaining and funny. But essentially, Hohenheim just wants Heathcliff to express his free spirit. Hohenheim also says things that seem oddly serious at times, with anecdotes that seem to allude to something that he can actually relate to in retrospect. For instance, he says, "I learned that people are prone to forgetting their places when the going gets easy, when life becomes comfortable enough for them to consider the luxury of timely meals to be a certainty. Thus, I find these reminders to be quite useful." One could say that phrases like these could be learned wisdom from his own personal experiences that he is imparting onto the sinners in moments of uncanny seriousness. At the time, however, it can be perceived that it seems like he's just low-key kind of a soulless, very blunt kind of a jerk. But as we mentioned earlier, he has his moments of showing his care, in his own unique way of course, such as immediately acknowledging his flaws with how he handled the curiosity experiment with goading Don Quixote to taking off her shoes, unaware of the severity of the dangers. He takes ownership of his mistakes, elaborates on it, offers insight, and immediately makes the decision to allow Dawn have regular supplies of artificial blood that'll hopefully take off the edge of her hunger. But, of course, he just as easily returns back to his facade of just an egotistical, cold, and calculating researcher who only cares about the results he can get. He takes this to the next level by essentially distorting himself via the monolith, which, by the way, as an aside, based AF, bro, if I was a researcher and had access to something that let me distort, I'd do it in a heartbeat purely for curiosity too. Not smart at all given the dangers of, either turning immediately into a peccatula or a full-on abnormality instead of just distorting and being savable, but hey, part of the fun, am I right? Also, the fact that he and his team did bets on what he'd turn into if he did fail into a peccatula is honestly so funny and entertaining, and shows that for all the front that he puts on, he might actually have a soft spot for the people working with him. Prior to him distorting, he has a few moments of softer, almost melancholic moments as he talks to the sinners about his hypothesis and experiment. Not only does he tell Heathcliff not to grit his teeth, or that's bad for his dental health, which also mood, I should probably get a night guard TBH, but he notices that the sinners are concerned about things going awry, and he's trying to reassure them in his own way that by turning into a peccatula, his life is devoid of meaning, and that he'd be nothing more than a husk. He admits and acknowledges that he's not the likable type, and that he believes it would be easy to cut him down if need be. But of course, this is the culmination of everything that's happened so far. Of course, Hohenheim wouldn't turn into a peccatula, and instead, he distorts. His distortion form is intriguing. He looks like one of those 3D images you see with the blue and red glasses on, and actually, I am curious if anyone has those glasses and tried to wear them to see how Hohenheim appears. Does he appear 3D, like for real with those glasses on, or is it like not work? Do let me know in the comments if you tried that out though. But back to our observations of him, he has what looks to be an eye-like or lens-like sphere for a head, with multiple circles which may represent pupils within his one big eye at the center. Many red hands cling to his body as if desperately reaching out to grasp onto him in desperation. His own body posture, too, seems closed off, his arms crossed over his chest in a protective gesture. His first words in the distorted state seem to allude to something that happened in his past that influenced his form to what it is, as he says, "I can still hear them. Yes, I remember. I still do." Even the phrase to activate his Dungeon of Fathoms is peculiar in retrospect, with Lobotomy Corporation, 5 minutes, potentiality, anticipation, right hand. At the moment when you first encounter this, it seems like a jumble of random words, though Lobotomy Corporation is intriguing. But all these words are key to him recalling the vivid memory of his past, of the very thing that haunts him as evident in the claws that cling to him. As we enter his Dungeon of the Fathoms into a glitchy Lobotomy Corporation branch, Hohenheim is quite lucid, but also seems to try put on that facade of how he is just that egotistical, self-centered, selfish, calculating researcher self. He talks to us rather coherently through all of it, trying desperately to censor what he could of his time in a Lobotomy Corporation branch as a researcher. Their subordinates dressed in a lantern ego suit, most likely because that's probably the only double zero identity that they have sprites and skills to mess with for an easy related enemy for the Intervallo, though lore-wise I think they're just meant to represent any of the Lobotomy Corporation nuggets in his branch. There is also another person in particular who he tried to scrub out, who speaks of potentiality, and whose personality seems to be like that of an extrovert trying to adopt the introverted, abrasive, and defensive Hohenheim. This person seems intent on trying to change Hohenheim for the better, even going so far as to find a way to intrigue the stubborn researcher by asking him to join up to make Department of the Year award together with their opposite approaches to problems. As we continue our journey through, we know that eventually the Lobotomy Corporation branches fell. Hohenheim at this time is trying to put on the front that he put out a logical, rational explanation that since he's the one with the most accomplishments and thus value to his life compared to the rest, that he should be the one to use the final escape pod before the site gets buried. That's what we are led to believe, that is, as we finally get to fight him. Prior to getting into the fight, Hohenheim tries really hard to remain cold and logical, telling us how we should go about doing the experiment of either suppressing him and returning him safely back to the research lab, or to simply let him distort further into an abnormality, essentially. But Heathcliff disagrees, stepping up, speaking about potentialities, and it is here where, if you haven't realized it already, Heathcliff was picked as Hohenheim's research assistant because it reminded him of his right-hand man. The very same extroverted dude from the backstreets who spoke of potentialities in the first place. There's a noise of what sounds like flesh breaking as we get into the fight. I won't go over the fights in details. He just shields, saps up your sanity, gets a billion poise, and shoots lasers from his eyes sometimes. Also in the roof above, you got a little eyeball dude staring at you. What I do want to focus on a bit on is that Heathcliff wrote the abnormality log on him, which includes observations that, yes, Hohenheim is rather pompous, but there seems to be something deeper to Hohenheim's character. Heathcliff can tell there's a bond between him and his assistant researchers, Alyssa and Martin, and he even listens and takes the time to explain to Heathcliff about why his suggestions may be wrong, rather than just completely ignoring him or belittling him like the sinners sometimes do. Even as you fight Hohenheim and encounter the event choices, you're slowly breaking his facade, revealing his insecurities that he tried so desperately to hide. Our fights with him, our discussions with him, are essentially like violent therapy, which, given Project Moon's streak of their games, is honestly quite normal, to be honest. I'm sure our sinners will all get their own intense therapy sessions much later, but back to Hohenheim, you change his passives quite literally when doing these events, like changing his adaptation to maladaptation, from his defense mechanism lowering it to inadequate defense mechanism, and even his confirmation bias to self-doubt. I like how these are opposites to what they are, and these terms relate to the self in psychology. Even if you look at his panic response, it is anguish, not something you'd expect if he was truly a narcissist. Slowly but surely, we unravel the truth. And this is because, once you beat him, you find out that the true reality of what happened that day the Lobotomy Corporation branch collapsed, Johann, the one who got close to Hohenheim, and the others all chose to let Hohenheim return to the surface on the last escape pod. Hohenheim was filled with grief, trying desperately to claw through the rubble to get back to the ones who'd managed to open up his closed, introverted heart. In the end, though, there is seldom permanent happiness to be found in the city, as tragedy abounds in this cruel world. As we exit the Dungeon of the Fathoms, Hohenheim returning to normal, he declares that his experiment was, in fact, a failure, because he was trying to see if he could put on a facade throughout his distortion by holding onto his sense of self. Of course, us being 100% qualified therapists stopped him from staying as a distortion and uncover the truth behind it all. But he smiles a little and thanks us and speaks of potentiality, which just seems to me like another key word for hope. a hope in this cruel, dreary world of the city. It's cute. He says this is our final meeting, but I honestly hope we will see him again in some distant future. Hohenheim is by far one of my most favorite side characters that they've introduced in Limbus Company. Perhaps it's because I can relate to some ways, being introverted and closed off myself, and I am technically a researcher in my IRL career, but I just think there's something heartwarming about seeing someone try so hard to seem like an uncaring, heartless person who only cares about results, to instead actually be someone who cares, but shows it in perhaps subtle ways on the surface. Perhaps a little bit of tsundere even. I do say, Hohenheim's story managed to give me some teary eyes. It tugged at my heartstrings in a good way, and I like how his arc was essentially built up and concluded in this brief intervallo, intermixed with more lovely center banter and even some fan service for Lobotomy Corporation fans. It's good stuff, and I really feel like they wrote and presented this intervallo well. It was very cohesive and concise. I can only wait for perhaps another year before this gets voiced over when we get to do a hard version rerun. Well, that's really all about I have to say for now. Besides yearning and appreciating the Johann and Hohenheim doomed yaoi fanart that I've seen ever since this intervallo dropped, I think Project Moon is doing their best, bit by bit, to improve in small aspects and test the community's reception to it. I hope future events and even the Kanto may have some more unique EX clears on occasion. May Limbus Company continue to do well for years to come. While this may be one of my personal favorites, if not my current favorite intervallo, I guess only time will tell before that may get usurped. Perhaps even the upcoming one about the sweepers will knock this one out of the park. But that one seems like it'd be more serious, so we'll see. Anyway, thanks for listening to me yap. I have never done this kind of video before where I just yap and semi-analyze something that I like, instead of, my other stuff. If you enjoy this, do feel free to let me know. I'm not sure if I'll do this for like every intervallo or whatnot, but we'll see how the mood strikes. 2025 is a new year of beginnings to try stuff out, after all. Oh, and personal shill really quick. I typically stream new Limbus Company the day they come out over on Twitch, starting about 30 minutes after the maintenance is over. Come hang out, links in the description. Anyway, hope to see you there or next time for a regular video. Take care everyone, keep it vibin', bye!